This episode is about the state of research about the first author of history, allegedly. Is En-hedu-ana to be regarded as such? And we will specify this a little bit. We will look at the state of research on the topic of En-hedu-ana as alleged author of šara, NMS, the song The Lady of All the Rituals. While doing so, we will reflect about the requirements of substantial research. In this respect, this episode has a double aim: to give insights into research until now, and to display some hermeneutic and methodological issues. A systematic approach is necessary regarding to the ancient original sources, as well as to research literature. For that, we start with hermeneutics, go over to methodology, and from that to outcome. Hermeneutics, the art of question. So we have to ask, is En-hedu-ana to be regarded as historical author of šara? At least most scholars have asked this question, and of course it is interesting from many viewpoints with regard to literary history, history in general, and others. For Helle 2019, followed by Konstantopoulos 2021, this question is of no importance. Instead, they are interested in the Old Babylonian scribes of the šara tablets, and they assume that these scribes have invented authorship. The interest of ancient scholars in šara is in this view reduced to authorship. The question of authorship is usually posed from the perspective of our times, in an ethic way. One asks for authorship in the context of literary production. It might be interesting to ask if there is an ancient perspective of authorship. For that question, I refer to the next episode. In order to find the right answers, we have to build the reconstructed picture of ancient times on solid grounds, on evidence through sources. In the case of textual evidence, this requires a thorough philological analysis and close reading. If this fundament is wrong, then all conclusions as well. An example: šara is interpreted as if En-hedu-ana would quit her position as priestess, as high priestess of Nanna, and instead become high priestess of Innana, with far-reaching conclusions built on that. The problem is that the text does explicitly state something else. The text gives three clear statements about the first-person speaker in the text. The first is En-men En-hedu-ana men. I am the high priestess. I am En-hedu-ana. The second is En-hedu-ana men arazu gamurabdu. I am En-hedu-ana. I'm going to speak a prayer to you. And now the important third one, En-dadaga men. I am the brilliant high priestess of Nanna. This statement is nowhere retracted or denied. Nowhere is it said that this En-hedu-ana might be an priestess of Innana. The text states explicitly that this person remains priestess of Nanna and wishes to remain. That's just the claim En-hedu-ana, or this first person speaker in the text, makes. Attention! Beware if no sources are given, especially with the topic of authorship, which is eminently about texts. Methodologically, it is necessary that things are proven from the original sources. And the same holds true for research literature. Attention if someone does not refer to studies, not even to comprehensive ones. Next, we have to differentiate between specific texts. It is of no use to make sweeping statements about En-hedu-ana as author of several texts. The statements must be worked out from the individual source. An example. Some scholars count Innana and Ebich to the oeuvre of En-hedu-ana. But, for example, the relationship between Innana and An is completely different in Innana and Ebich and in šara. It is completely contrary. So for the question of authorship, these sources have to be kept apart. In some cases, we notice considerable differences between several parts of texts. This is the case with the last lines of šara, which are isolated from the rest of the text with respect to content and style. They form a separate epilogue. Of language and spellings. There is not much. There is Zgoll 1997, Ketman 2010, and there is often quoted Civil 1980. Civil states that he has the suspicion that the language and wording of the song Innin gura is from Larsa times. That means the 20th, 19th century. In his opinion, the song might be composed by another Ain priestess, a daughter of Rim-Sin, so to say a colleague of En-hedu-ana, a later one. He does not give evidence for his suspicion. The point is that Civil refers only to the song Innin gura, not to šara. But it is quoted as evidence for šara in the discussion of šara and its possible author. We can examine here an interesting phenomenon. These three sentences, not more than a note, are quoted extensively. They are most often taken as decisive argument against a possible authorship of En-hedu-ana regarding šara. But the quote is wrong. The problem is typical for scholarship. B quotes A, C quotes A, but takes it from B, not from A, and so on. And if it is in the world, it is in the world. It is interesting that the discussion of Zgoll 1997, several pages about the concrete textual, critical, orthographical, lexematical, and other indications for the question of authorship of En-hedu-ana in šara, are only referred to very rarely. So this may have something to do with language, it is German, and of course with the fact that the book has become out of print for a while. So maybe an upload to the usual scholarship platforms might help for the future, but we do not have to be too optimistic. Let's take it as it is. Even for Innin gura, it might be an interesting discussion how much adaptation might occur during several hundred years of transmission. In Mesopotamia, there is evidence for such transmission, so there is material to analyze. See, for example, the alabaster disc of En-hedu-ana, okay, quite short, but see the Kesh hymn and many more examples. Westenholz holds it possible with regard to En-hedu-ana as author that later alterations have occurred in the long process of scribal transmission, yet their substance, the substance of En-hedu-ana's hymns, is without a doubt authentically her own. Quotation end. So I would note that there are alterations. Ninmeshara has been given an epilogue. For that, I refer to a later point. Or Ketman, 2010. Orthography is not a mandatory criterion. Zgoll, 1997, lists different categories of criteria regarding the date of Ninmeshara, important for the question of authorship. Textual criticism, orthography, and intertextual references. So these are concrete observations regarding the question of authorship of Ninmeshara. And Ketman says that orthography is not a mandatory criterion, refers to the hymn to Kesh or to Shulgi-A, where we have Old Babylonian copies without archaisms, and says that the spellings of Ninmeshara do not argue against an origin of Ninmeshara in Old Akkadian time. He has a tendency to regard En-hedu-ana as author of Ninmeshara. Style and rhetoric. There has been noted that not all passages in Ninmeshara are in the style of the first person speaking, and that after an indication of authorship, the speech situation would change from first to third person. This has to be reflected together with the aforementioned analysis of substantially different parts of Ninmeshara. From line 143 to the doxology 152 and following, there is an epilogue which has to be separated from the prayer, from the song. Of course, first person is no indicator for no secure indicator for authorship, since speaker ego is not automatically to be equated with author ego, for sure. In Ninmeshara, even passages after the reference to authorship are in the speech situation of first and second person. I quote, "Because of your seized husband, because of your seized protégé, as long as your anger has become great because of that, no one will appease your heart." That is clearly directed from a first person to a second person, Innana. And by the way, it does not sound as if the situation would have changed for the better after the line with En-hedu-ana having born the song. Another point regarding style and rhetoric. The rhetoric and structure of the song Ninmeshara is extremely complex. Compared to other Mesopotamian songs and prayers, as innin gura, or for the prayers as, for example, hand-lifting prayers, these are of comparatively simple structure compared to Ninmeshara. In the end, the pressing problem has not yet been solved. So this has been counted as indicator for taking the intentions of the prayer, Sumerian arazu, line 81, as real concerns. They seem to be as real as intentions in other anonymously transmitted prayers, for example, against illness. The intentions are specific for a high priestess called En-hedu-ana living in a civil war. We come to the consideration of the content. Helle 2019 and 2020 postulates that authorship is the central concern of Ninmeshara. 2019, authorship created by Old Babylonian scholars, an hypothesis to be proven, since they, quote, desperately needed to assert their importance. 2020 authorship as concern of En-hedu-ana's text. Quote, the entire exaltation thus revolves around its own composition and the coming into being of its authorial figure. I cannot go in detail here, but these are hypotheses, partly on wrong premises. See former slides. The aim of the text has been deduced from the perspective of authorship studies. More about the content from other perspectives. Halton-Sverd, 2018, state that En-hedu-ana puts her self-interpretation at the very center of this composition. It appears that the poem is based on real events, but we do not know of En-hedu-ana's exile apart from this document. Zgoll, 2021, finds the aims as given in the text, that it shall influence Innana to stop the civil war. It shall save En-hedu-ana and Innana's Ushum-gal-ana, that refers to the king. And with that, the text aims to prove that Innana is the most powerful among the gods, that Nanna is subordinate to Innana, and that En-hedu-ana is still the priestess of Nanna. Here the aim of the text is taken from the text, as we would do it with other prayers. I remind you that line 81 identifies Ninme-shara as a prayer. I am going to speak a prayer to you, is the content of this line. The historical and theological statements in Ninme-shara are quite specific. The historical context depicted refers to the situation of the civil war of Sumerian city-states, especially Ur, against the Akkadian realm, naming a certain Lugal-ane of Ur, and many details about the life of the speaking person. On the level of the gods, the contrast between Innana and Nanna that dominates the song is immense. Innana is positioned hierarchically above all other gods, the Annuna, and especially above Nanna. Enlil plays no role, he's just mentioned. With this proclamation of Innana as supreme deity, while Enlil is not important at all and Nanna is explicitly subordinated to Innana, the composition of the song cannot be dated to the Ur III period, and the following Isin-Larsa period in the wake of Ur III cannot be assumed either. And then another point which came out during my last studies of the text and its contents, my Halim analysis of myths in Ninme-shara. These myths are extremely anti-Sumerian. So-called rebellious cities like Ur and its people, the Sumerians, are humiliated. They are killed. The text can therefore not have been composed nor used or conceived as a symbol of Sumerian. An important prerequisite to understand how the content of the text has to be evaluated is to clarify its text genre. Scholars have referred to Ninme-shara as autobiography, quite often, as story, as inscription or similar to royal inscriptions, and as ritual text. We have to differentiate precisely between the text on the one hand side and its genre, and the narrative material incorporated into the text on the other side. Halton-Sverd state that En-hedu-ana's texts are mainly religious poetry, hymns centered around temples and stories about deities. With regard to Ninmeshara, this holds true if it is meant hymns centered around temples and centered around stories about deities. Since the text Ninmeshara is not a story, but stories have been woven into the text, especially or mainly mythical and historical narrative material. The text itself is clearly a prayer, which is the same as a ritual text, a sacred song. You can refer for that, you can look at episode 2.5. Only the later epilogue is styled as part of a story. Come briefly back to the thesis of authorship. In general, we often find theses about authorship which seem to stem from general assumptions based on the cultural context as reconstructed by each scholar respectively. A few scholars think that some scribe might have composed the song Ninmeshara. Lambert, for example, assumes a ghost writer as author, as in the case, similar to the case of royal inscriptions. So he assumes a ghost writer in Old Akkadian times. Or Glasner thinks of a royal scholar in Old Akkadian times as well. Different from that, Gadotti states that this literary composition might have been composed in the context of the Old Babylonian scribal school. This has to be considered in the context of textual genre. Is Ninmeshara an inscription, sort similar to a royal inscription? Is it a political proclamation? Is it just a literary composition? For these questions, I refer to the previous slide and to the next episode. Besides that, we find the thesis of an authorship of En-hedu-ana herself in many publications. See, for example, the following ones. And I quote Foster, 2019, who speaks of a highly individual style, autobiographical and historical content, certain spellings and usages and ancient subscripts to manuscripts of her work, naming her as author, referring to Zgoll 1997. He compares the authorship, or the genesis better, of Ninmeshara, of En-hedu-ana songs to the Era epic, to the genesis of the Era epic, and refers to other authors in Mesopotamian sources. A remark to the point that En-hedu-ana is named in ancient subscripts. In the case of Ninmeshara, the information about her authorship is even woven into the song itself. With all of these important and stimulating contributions of research in mind, the next episode will be about a new approach to this question of first author in world history. See you then!